we're going to switch here and have, now that we've heard Dr. McGee and Dr. Oligood talk about the implication for medical and biomedical research and some very specific ways in which it's having impact on disease burdens, particularly diabetes, and that is global, to Sam Stein from the Huffington Post, who's going to talk more, put this more in a political context rather than that.
Because I'm not a scientist.
No, you are. That is. Well, then we're going to go back to a scientist, so to speak, Dr. DeCherney over there, who's also not a hippie.
Well, I need to share a story before I start about Alan. Alan came up to me right before I came here, and he said that he knew my mom when she was a resident, right? And my mom is an obstetrician, gynecologist, and I quickly texted my mom to say I was going to be on a panel with Alan, and she said, remind him that he noted you in utero before I told anyone I was pregnant with you, so thanks for spotting me, Alan. I'm not a scientist, I'm a political reporter, and so I figured that for my presentation I would do what I am more comfortable doing, which is talking about sort of the political story of sequestration, and basically answering the question, how could NIH cuts that every lawmaker universally decries, how could something like that come to be? And it's a really difficult question to answer, and I've written about it a lot, and the best explanation, which isn't a very sufficient one or particularly satisfying one, is that once it was settled on as a concept, there just inertia took over, to borrow your word. And so I came up, I'm really bad at technology, by the way, which is why my PowerPoint looks a little bit sad compared to everyone else's. But I came up with this idea of 16 stages of Washington coping with sequestration, how DC went from loathing to loving to loathing to fretting about the cuts that they passed. And so with that, let's begin. Let's see, I did this. Okay, so the story basically starts back in the summer of 2011, when for the first real time in political history, the two parties were at gridlock over whether or not to raise the nation's debt limit. And over a series of very high-stakes meetings, the two sides basically came to an agreement that they would raise the debt ceiling in exchange for cuts of equal consequence or value. And so they had a little trouble figuring out what kind of things they would cut. And so instead of deciding right then and there what they would cut, they came up with this idea of sequestration. And sequestration was never supposed to take effect. They would have it as sort of a backstop in case a super committee designed to do deficit and debt reduction couldn't come to agreement. But basically everyone said, listen, we're going to come to an agreement. We know how bad sequestration is. Don't worry about it. And of course, they couldn't come to an agreement. And so after they came out with this deal, this idea that you'd have sequestration as a backstop, each side sort of came out and said, yeah, we did pretty well. We have John Boehner saying, I got 98% of what I wanted in the debt deal. Around that time, I was attending these briefings with White House officials where they were saying, we got what we wanted. We protected Medicaid, Social Security, and Medicare. We escaped hostage-taking intact. The president will be fine through the 2012 elections. Cheer us. And so we kept going. But then, as the campaign hit, keep in mind the cuts had not taken effect yet. People were fretting them, but they hadn't taken effect yet. The super committee hadn't come up with a deal. And then we get to the campaign. And suddenly, neither side really wants to take credit for something that each of them said was a good deal. And so what you have here is President Obama saying, sequestration's not going to happen. And then, this is one of my favorite slides, you have the birth of a hashtag for all you Twitter fans out there. This was a big thing during the campaign with Republicans touting hashtag ObamaQuester. Suddenly, the sequestration was all Barack Obama's idea. Never mind that John Boehner had said he got 98% of what he wanted. And then you had Mitt Romney, who said, it's a strange proposal in the first place. It's even stranger that it's being put in place. This is actually one of the slides where I had a video, but I'm so technologically incapable that I couldn't figure out how to play a video on these things, so I went with the picture instead. And then when basically all the blame game was done, you had what I called the freak out. The sky's falling. Among the items that the White House warned would happen, fewer food inspections, disruption in education programs, loss of nutritional assistance, so on and so forth. You may remember this is about a month or two before sequestration was going to go into effect, and they desperately wanted people to get rid of it. And so they were ramping up the stakes to say, if this happens, all of these consequences will take place. And that was followed by basically acceptance. They couldn't come to an agreement, largely because neither side wanted, the Republicans would not agree to tax hikes, Democrats wouldn't agree to entitlement reforms. They basically failed. After acceptance came nonchalance. What exactly was the big deal in the first place? This article I actually remembered vividly, because this is the one that actually got me interested in writing about sequestration. The Washington Post, I believe the date on this is June 30th, so that's about a month and a half in to when sequestration took effect. The Washington Post had already deemed it a big nothing burger. And I remember thinking to myself, that's a little bit premature, probably, considering these cuts are going to go in over time. A lot of agencies are going to backload them. They're going to dip into savings accounts. They're going to try to prolong as much misery as possible. But we had reached the point in the debate where we had said it was all a big deal, all oversold. The White House wanted a replacement package. They oversold the consequences. Sequestration really didn't matter. And then we had the one thing about sequestration that people really freaked out about, which was FAA cuts. And I don't know if any of you recall this, but this was a big deal for like a week, where Congress was really inconvenienced because they had to wait in lines at Reagan National Airport because there were fewer FAA inspectors. And suddenly, when you had to wait in line at an airport for 30 minutes, that was the end of it. And over a brilliant 2-day legislative period, I've never seen Washington move quite as fast, but it was just boom, they were done. This is not going to last. Sequestration for the FAA was basically, it wasn't reversed. They gave FAA a lot of flexibility for how to administer the cuts, and suddenly we had quicker airport lines. So that was the mild annoyance phase. And then we were back to nonchalance again. This is, sequestration, it turned into a non-event. This was referenced earlier, Dr. Francis Collins singing the blues. Again, I had a video. Let's see if this works, actually. There is a video thing here. No, I can't do it. I'm wrong. But Dr. Francis Collins of the NIH, who happens to be quite musically talented, sang the sequestration blues, and I recommend it. It's pretty catchy. It's not bad.
It is.
It's not the best song ever, but he was trying, and he was trying. It sort of underscores how desperate some of these agencies were, some of these organizations were, to put a spotlight on what was happening. Again, to go back to my first point, they understood the consequences of the budget cuts that they had to implement, and while they weren't taking effect in that moment, primarily because they were trying to backload them, they recognized that they were going to have a profound effect, and so you had them literally picking up guitars and warning about it. So that was the desperation stage. Then came the documentation stage. This is where I pat myself on the back. We started looking into this, and at the Huffington Post, we decided that, after the Washington Post had declared that it was a big nothing burger, we did what was essentially the most basic form of journalism. We started looking for stories. And we did a Google News search. I remember this night. We worked actually 4 or 5 hours into the night, my colleague Amanda Turkle and I, and we typed in into the Google News search, we typed in sequestration or sequestration effects, or whatever search terms you wanted, and we just looked for local papers. And what we picked up was that there was a ton of local press for what was happening, because they understood how it trickled down, whereas the national press was largely either not interested or saying it was overblown. And so within the first weekend, basically, we had found 100 sequestration stories from around the country. Layoffs, furloughs, cutbacks, etc. So we put up a piece. It got pretty good reaction. And that led to 3 long-form pieces that I and several colleagues collaborated on. By long-form, I'm talking about 4,000 to 5,000 words, a couple months in the making, going out into the field, talking to people, documenting the effects. The first was what sequestration meant for mothers who had kids in Head Start. The second was the Public Defenders Program, which, sorry to the people involved in the NIH, the Public Defenders Program, in my opinion, was probably the hardest hit program in the country. People were looking at, if sequestration hadn't been fixed this budget round, they're looking at something to the extent of 90 furlough days over the course of the year. About 1 out of every 4 days they're going to have to be forced on furlough. That was an incredible statistic. And then the final one was sequestration's effect on the NIH. And that last one actually birthed probably the most journalistic output I've had in my very brief career. People were emailing me, calling me, writing me, saying, "You have no idea how bad it is. You don't understand the extent to which we are struggling for cash, the extent to which young people are leaving the field, the extent to which promising scientific research is going to go unfunded." And so we did about, I'd say, over a dozen follow-ups, including interviews with Dr. Collins, in which he said, "God help us if we get a worldwide pandemic." Next one, the uh-oh phase. We don't like that cut. So basically things had stayed the same, more or less, through the summer, and then into October, and then the government shut down. And suddenly the idea of funding a government program became much more pronounced and much more obvious to people who wanted to look. And I remember one moment in particular, which is the NIH announced that it couldn't do clinical cancer trials during the government shutdown. And members of Congress lost their minds, and rightfully so. But people who had championed the sequester, or people who were happy with the cuts, suddenly became incredibly alarmed at what was happening. And what you had was a bunch of fiscal hawks donning lab coats, literally putting on lab coats, hence the next slide, putting on lab coats and saying, "We have to fund the NIH. We have to do this. Open these doors." And it was just a little bit, discordant, I guess, because for a while they had been perfectly content with the cuts and not willing to talk about the damage that was being inflicted on the NIH. And suddenly when the program for these cancer clinical trials was shut down, they were the NIH's biggest champion. Keep in mind, they didn't want to go back to pre-sequester levels. They just wanted to open the NIH. So that was part 2. Now we go to recognition. On October 17th, Congress passes a bill to end the shutdown. But because there was a newfound appreciation for government spending in places like the NIH, and because Democrats, to be frank about it, had gotten a bit of a backbone on this, they wouldn't really agree to an end of the government shutdown unless there was a framework in place to restore some of the sequestration cuts. And so, lo and behold, we have reversal. On December 10th, 2013, we have a deal that replaces $63 billion worth of sequestration cuts. Yeah, that was a screen grab. I couldn't figure it out. And suddenly everyone is so happy with themselves. Obama, congratulations on the budget deal. Back to this one. Paul Murray, Patty Murray, Paul Ryan, saying, "We did a really good job. We got a deal." But, there was still residual fear and anger. The funding for the NIH, even after this budget deal, even after the appropriations to fill in the budget deal, $714 million in pre-sequestration levels. You take an inflation calculator, which I figured out you can do on the internet, and you can actually see that it's the equivalent of George W. Bush's 2002 NIH funding level. In essence, we haven't moved the funding in 12 years. So, residual fear and anger part 2. This is an event I attended about 2 weeks ago. Some of the best young scientists in the country came to Washington, D.C. to get awards from the president, recognition for the work that they're doing. And afterwards, they go to the National Press Club, and they have a roundtable, and they just talk about how they feel their field is progressing, what kind of fears they have about the funding levels. This is a quote from Dr. Andrew Goodman. It says, "The people whose work has not been funded, they sort of disappear. Their websites are gone." I miswrote it, sorry. They don't come to their meetings, and that's the last I hear about it. I mean, that's a scary thing. That's a scary quote in my estimation. You're taking promising scientists, you're telling them, "Sorry, we can't fund you," and instead of sticking around, they go somewhere else. You lose them. You're losing a generation. And finally, we have hopefulness. I think this is final. Maybe not. But March 11th, Congress passes NIH funding. It's a $120 million over 10-year deal for pediatric research funds for the NIH. This is called the Gabriella Manure Act, and it was championed by Eric Cantor, pictured here. It basically says we are going to restore a very small portion of the NIH funding, and we're going to pay for it by taking away federal funds for party conventions, DNC, RNC conventions, and it doesn't actually appropriate the funds; it allocates the funds. So lawmakers still have to fill it in; they have to fulfill the promise, essentially, of what this act holds. And listen, it's not. If you look at it from a strictly numerical standpoint, it's nothing. If you're still $714 million low of pre-sequestration levels, then restoring $12 million a year is a drop in the bucket. But the optimist can look at it and say, Congress is coming together, and they recognize that there is a reason, there is a value to NIH funding. Hopefulness Part 2, and this is where I end. April 4th, a bipartisan group of lawmakers, including 25 Republicans, sent a letter to appropriators calling for NIH funding to be at $32 billion minimum. Right now, I believe it's at 29.6 or something like that. So they recognize that it needs to be even higher. And I would say that one last thing before I end this. Yesterday, I don't know if any of you tuned in, there was a major hearing in the Senate by the Appropriations Committee featuring the head of the Energy Department, featuring Francis Collins, featuring other people, someone at the DARPA, who talked about the importance of funding and research and the value of the government investing in a generation of researchers who can make scientific studies that materialize 30 years from now. And the good news for people who care about this stuff is that everyone on the dais, every lawmaker there said, we agree with you. They disagree on how to pay for it. Republicans think you should still cut entitlements in order to free up money to pay for it. Dick Durbin was the one person who I remember putting out an alternative. We said, let's have a 95-cent cigarette tax to pay for it. But there's optimism for the first time in several years that everyone agrees on the everyone agrees on the goal. They just still have disagreements on the objective. And so with that, I will leave you all. Thank you.